It's been an incredibly active year so far for storm development. Let's start off with the tornado countdown for the year so far. And we've got about 1,360 tornadoes. That is well above average for this time of year. As you recall, for the entire year last year was 1,910 tornadoes. So we're well on our way to meeting or even exceeding that level just last year. But it hasn't been just tornadoes, it's been hail too. We've had a series of storm threats. We had a very active fall as we transitioned into more of that Enso Neutral, which we are at currently right now. And I think that active trend continues at least for the couple of more months, especially for the northern corridor, as that jet stream continues to remain on the northern side, and you get some of that northwest flow, bringing those storm developments with those mesoscale convective systems and potential derecho setups at times. And then we also have high winds as well. So there's been an excessive amount of high wind reports across the US with that elevated storm threat that just seems to be relentless week after week. And overall, we're starting to see a slight transition in some of the weather patterns from at least on the longer range, from an Enso Neutral transitioning into more of that weak La Nina again, which what we saw last year, favoring as we trend towards that fall and the winter months. So where we stand right now, we've had 3 named storms from the tropics. The main development region has been quiet overall, with below average temperatures coming off the African coast. The Saharan dust has been alive and prevalent so far. That's been suppressing the activity. And one of the regions too, as well as into the Caribbean, it's also been pretty cool down there into the Caribbean. And there's the equatorial Pacific, starting to see that trend of some of those cooler water starting to cool down of what they've been over the last couple of months. And you can see the transition just in the last 7 days, as we're starting to see a little bit more upwelling starting to take shape from that what was Invest 97L. It never did form to something tropical, but it did stay out there and cool those waters out down there in the Gulf. And then, of course, out there in the main development region, we're continuing seeing that cooling trend. But we're also seeing more blues starting to show up on the map. And that is some of the cooler waters that are trying to trend and kind of take over eventually, I think, in a couple of months, more of that weak La Nina again. At least it's favoring that in the longer range. So if we look at the overall criteria where we are currently right now, you can see the trend over the last 10 years. And if we take you back through, say, 2023, that was our last El Nino year, that 22 coming into 23. But then we transitioned to more about a weak La Nina, which is where we were last winter and where we were back in 2023. So as we went into 24, once we got into the spring months, we transitioned into more of that Enso Neutral, which is currently where we are right now. That's when the severe threat really started to ramp up and really elevate. The tornado count was over 300 in March, April, and May. Very active June as well. And then even right now, we've currently had 61 tornadoes in the month of July. But you can see the trend, or about as neutral as you can get. I mean, neutral is basically 0. And overall, the last 3 months, we are negative 0.1. But over the last 2 months, you can see the predominant trend, and especially over the last 7 to 10 days, it's been a noticeably dive trending southbound and leaning more towards heavily favored, deeper into that Enso Neutral, favoring that weak La Nina. And I do feel just like this time last year, we're going to make that transition likely in the fall back to at least a weak La Nina for probably fall and winter. And then even the longer range looks to transition back into that Enso Neutral again into the spring of 2026. So we're really kind of technically not going anywhere. We're kind kind of repeating the same weather pattern over the last couple of years, and I think that trend continues. Currently, we're in that Enso neutral setup is what we're experiencing right now. But you can see the latest update from the Climate Prediction Center still favors that Enso neutral through the next couple of months. But by the time we hit October, it does have a little slightly, barely slightly increasing a 56 probability of trending more weak La Nina versus Enso neutral. So therefore, the chances of a La Nina conditions continue to increase as we trend towards that fall and especially into that winter of 2025 and 26. And overall, the trend looks like this. And if you can see the map, we're not talking a drastic La Nina or anything like that. Just like last year, we're going to be kind of like on the borderline again. I think it ultimately favors more of a weak La Nina versus an Enso neutral. And I think we might stay in a weak La Nina for probably, 4, 5, possibly 6 months before we transfer back into the spring of 26, back into an Enso neutral. So overall, I do feel it's going to be, similar to what we actually saw last year in the fall of the winter months. But currently where we stand right now, this is the overall satellite picture for today, July the 20th. We do have what was the kind of the remnants of the DNA of that 93L that never came to fruition. A piece of it snuck off and continued to remain westbound and producing more cloud cover down there in the hill country. Not any crazy rain amounts or anything like that, but it is producing some scattered showers at times. Most of the activity is well north, because we do have another piece of that actually went northbound into Arkansas. Now it's getting caught up in that conveyor belt of moisture we've seen of late, and it's continuing to down that northwest flow along a frontal boundary. So we got the remnants of what was 93L, at least a piece of it is built into the northwest flow, and the flooding rains that are continuing to unfold as we're seeing that more ridging starting to build in over the desert southwest. So we get these up and over the ridge, and we're going to be seeing that storm track alive and well to the north across the northern plains, through the upper Midwest, into the Ohio Valley. That's where predominantly the storm track will be, as this ridge of high pressure will continue to build. And that's also going to bring the heat. So now that it's rained a lot, right, you got a lot of water on the ground, and now we're starting to see that more of that south wind pulling in that Gulf moisture. That's only going to add to those humidity values. And now we have widespread heat advisories, even excessive heat warnings across Kansas and much of Missouri. That's where we're going to be seeing heat intensity values of 110, 115 range. And then, of course, further to the north, you're in that line of fire of that conveyor belt of moisture. Seems like one after another. You're going to get hit again today with more storms. We had some flooding the other day in Virginia, and we're going to be seeing more flooding rains today, as predominantly over the next 5 days, that piece of energy sneaks to the north, gets wrapped up in this conveyor belt of moisture. So the line of fire is across the Dakotas, through Minnesota, Wisconsin. There's another piece of energy that will come through Iowa, back through Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And then some of that energy, again, that remnants of that 93L, at least some portions of the DNA aspect of it, will try to sneak back out of the southeast coast by the time we head into, say, Thursday and Friday. And then some of it tries to sneak back over Florida. At least it brings increasing rain amounts for them. And we kind of repeat the same type of setup, as we've got the ridge of high pressure continuing to build over Texas and Oklahoma. So you continue that drying out period after you've seen that deluge for a month or two. And then out west, we're seeing that more of that monsoonal flow, but it's mainly across areas of New Mexico At times, Arizona gets into the action, but it's been predominantly New Mexico with that with the overall monsoonal flow. And folks in the Pacific Northwest, and of course, much of California is just like, where's all the rain? Because we're definitely not seeing it out here, and I don't think you don't think it's going to be coming in the foreseeable future. So for the next 7 to 10 days, we'll be watching in the tropics. Even though it's been fairly quiet, we still have at least some sort of possibilities that low can hang off over those warm waters off the coast long enough. We do have a 30 or 40% probability that some of that energy gets locked up into areas of the southeast or around the Carolinas and the North Carolinas. And then, of course, some of that energy will get pulled in the northern Gulf, and we have to watch for possible development just like 93L that never came to fruition. And this is leaning in kind of the same way. It's going to be too close to land that it'll still bring heavy flooding rains, but not no organized development. But will also be the culprit that will likely elevate these temperatures. Once that moisture rings out, you get the sinking air on the backside of that, and I think the extreme heat really starts to kick in across a good part of North Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, much of Missouri, Illinois. By the time you hit that 26, 27, 28 time frame towards end of July, those temperatures are going to be rising quickly. And some of the hottest temperatures you've seen, which is not out of the question because we're heading into the hottest time of the year, and we are only going to see that trend continue as the dominating ridge will still continuing to build across the southern plains, the central plains. You'll likely see your triple digit temperatures, and a streak of triples likely unfolding by then. And if we take a look at the longer range as we head into the tropics, we're not really seeing too much, right? We've only had 3 storms, and all 3 of those storms actually didn't even last more than 24 hours before they dissipated. They're all on the very, very weak side, even though unfortunately some of that DNA of Barry got snuck up into Texas and of course produced all those flooding, devastating rains for them. But overall in the tropics, it looks fairly quiet with the Saharan dust and the main development region on the cooler side, and even on the vertical velocity index. As you look at the overall map, we're not really seeing too much greens kind of show up on a map. That's typically upward rising motion air. We're seeing a lot more sinking air, especially as we trend towards that August timeframe, and a good part of August. So August could be very quiet in the tropics. We're seeing a lot of sinking air, especially on the second half of August. And not just that, we're seeing a lot more sinking air over the good part of the U.S. as well, which implies kind of a drier and, of course, hotter month. So overall, we've been predominantly in that Enso neutral for most of 25. It kind of made that transition as we began that March timeframe of this year. And so overall, the temperatures have been kind of neutral, right? We've seen some slightly above average temperatures across the West, slightly above average temperatures across the upper Midwest and much of the Southeast, a little bit slightly above average across the Northeast. It has been slightly cooler on average across the middle part of the country, but overall, it's overall about less than a half a degree above average year to date for 2025. But we're starting to make that trend, right? As we go into that second half of the year, as we look at some of the longer range, more the seasonal type anomaly outlooks, as we tend to favor slightly on that weak La Nina versus the Enso, that definitely tends to favor a little bit warmer air building in and overall kind of drier air for more of the country. So if you look at the latest update, it's got pretty much the entire US at least slightly above average, or right at 1 to 2, possibly 3 degrees above average at times. It only has about 15% of the U.S. seeing below average temperatures, and I feel like that's pretty spot on what we see going forward. And if we do see development, and if we do see a more favored area, this is the area that has seen a lot of rain. You're likely going to get more humidity in these areas, and you're more susceptible to get the tropical activity activity as we get into September and October. So I think that's why the Climate Prediction Center is kind of favoring more of those southeastern areas and across the eastern seaboard, just because of the overall tropical development. And as we see more of a drying out period for the northern central plains and some of the southern plains as well, as we get deeper into the summer months and as we transition at least into the beginning of fall. So guys, I appreciate you watching. Do like this video. Definitely hit the subscribe button and catch me next update where I protect you before and after the storm.